Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. The Greek parliament has approved the harsh austerity package from European Union creditors with a vote of 229 to 300. As part of the deal, lawmakers set aside 50 billion euros of public assets to act as collateral for the new debt. As dozens of MPs from Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' Syriza party abandoned him for the vote, riots raged on the streets outside the parliament where people clashed with police and fires burned. Meanwhile, Germans, upset at how their government pushed Greece into a corner, also expressed themselves on the streets. Protests took place in over a dozen German cities this week. Greece's agreement with the EU sets into motion what even the IMF admits is an unsustainable debt burden. Chenjerai, isn't this basically not necessarily the end of the story? I mean, sooner rather than later, Greece will have a debt repayment deadline. It won't be able to make it, and this whole story will start all over.
It really does look that way. If you look at this package, we see, adjustments to pensions, Greek pensions, which is kind of like something people like to focus on, in the Greek situation. But there's also tremendous cuts to social programs and really the whole neoliberal austerity disaster that is being called a social genocide. And youth within Greece and in Germany seem to recognize this. Just to focus on Greece for 1 second, 85% of those from 18 to 24 voted no on this bailout package. And so it shows like that this, the decisions that are made are completely ignoring this part of the population. In Germany, you see the rise of the Blockupy movement, and you can go to blockupy.org and learn more about how Germans are organizing against these austerity measures.
And then a day after GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump garnered the largest support among Republicans in a poll, he unsurprisingly found himself being hated by Latinos. A new poll by Univision finds that 70% of Latinos have a very low opinion of the businessman turned political candidate. A previous poll by Washington Post and ABC News found that 81% of Latinos disapproved of him. Trump has not shied away from making hateful and racist comments against undocumented immigrants from south of the border, claiming they're criminals and rapists. Now, Chenjerai, Donald Trump got 17% approval from Republicans, but the rest of that, 83%, was split between a very crowded field of candidates. Once the candidate field coalesces, do you think he will remain popular even among Republicans? And do you, by the way, see him as the Sarah Palin of the 2016 election?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that Donald Trump will not last as a leading candidate, because I think that Republicans will be savvy enough to realize that he's not going to be able to, ever have any chance of winning the presidency. But, thinking about this issue with Hispanic voters, Hispanic voters, Hispanic youth, and folks who are on a journey to citizenship, they're not just a demographic that politicians can't afford to ignore. They're at the center of the realities of what it means to be an American in 2015 and going forward. And the Republican Party is trying to appeal to these voters, and Trump's rhetoric really hurts that beyond his own campaign. So I thought that the statistic that half of the Republicans view Donald Trump favorably is really something that we should have to look at, because there's been a lot of joking about Trump, but we need to start to look back at the broader population that supports Trump and realize that maybe he's actually not just simply a clown, but tuned into some very disturbing attitudes.
Finally, President Obama, during a trip to Oklahoma City this week, was greeted by dozens of protesters, about 10 of whom were waving Confederate flags. The incident came less than 2 weeks after South Carolina voted to remove their Confederate flag from the grounds of the state house after the Charleston terror attack. President Obama is in Oklahoma to visit the El Reno Federal Correctional Institution. It is the first time that a sitting president has ever visited a federal prison, and the visit is part of the president's criminal justice reform agenda, which he explicitly addressed at the NAACP conference earlier this week. Also today, Dylan Roof, the confessed perpetrator of the Charleston massacre, will appear in court to be indicted. He faces 9 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of weapons possession. Chenjerai, do you see the waving of the Confederate flag at Obama part of the same spectrum of hate that the flag-waving Dylan Roof is on?
Well, I like that idea of a spectrum of hate. It would seem extreme for me to try to, connect someone like Dylan Roof, a mass murderer, to average, everyday white Americans and Americans who are flying the Confederate flag. The majority of them do appear to be white. But what we have to start to ask is, what are those connections? I mean, Dylan Roof did go to high school with Lindsey Graham, a politician here in South Carolina. And the Confederate flag, this investment in emotional attachment to the Confederate flag, which I witnessed in person as the flag was taken down last week in Columbia, there were people out there holding the flag. So what are people invested in emotionally? What kind of hierarchy? We have to ask these questions.
Chenjerai, thank you as always for your analysis, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
My guest is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break.